Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today is actually going to be non-military related. I'm actually going to kind of go back to what I originally did for a little bit, maybe like 4 years ago, and kind of talk about some book reviews. It's kind of what I'm more passionate about anyways. So today's video is actually going to be kind of free-flowing. It's not going to be too analytical, too in-depth, but I want to really talk about my recent books that I've been reading, more specifically within the realm of Japanese literature. So the three authors that I've kind of been really getting involved with are Natsume Soseki. So he wrote Kokoro, Sanshiro, among other things, and Yukio Mishima, which is probably one of the most interesting guys, I think, not even just in Japan, but in general, just because of his history, his nationalistic points of view. But he wrote the Sea of Fertility, I think it's like tetralogy is what it's called, which it has 4 books within. It's like a trilogy, but has 3, but a tetralogy has 4, which includes Spring Snow, Runaway Horses, Temple of Dawn. I think it's called The Decay of Angels, something like that. And then I want to briefly talk about what's his name? Yasunari Kawabata. I'm going to speak less about him just because I haven't read too many of his books, but the type of novels that he wrote, or that I've read by him, kind of tie into the whole theme that I'm going to talk about today. And that theme is going to be kind of comparing a couple of things. The first point that I really want to talk about is throughout all these books, one of the things that I find extremely interesting, and in my opinion, actually kind of applicable to today, especially in the United States in a sense, is the reconciliation between Western ideals and Japanese tradition. So in most of these novels, most of them that I've read, like for example, like The Sound of Waves by Yukio Mishima, Runaway Horses, Spring Snow, Sanshiro, Kokoro, they're all some type of coming to age story. But embedded within that, these novels is the idea that a lot of these characters, maybe not directly, but indirectly, are struggling with some sort of reconciliation between the adoption of Western ideals and kind of ways of thinking while maintaining Japanese tradition. So a lot of these books take place after the Russo-Japanese War, early 1900s, maybe mid-1900s, depending on the book. I think even some might take place earlier than that. I would have to look back, but I think for the most part, like Sanshiro, Yukio Mishima's Runaway Horses, Spring Snow, and Kokoro. Kokoro takes place in different parts just because it's point of view from the sensei and the point of view from the protagonist, I guess. So first, I'm gonna hop right into it. The biggest example of this, I kind of want to take 2 books. I'm going to take Sanshiro by Soseki and Runaway Horses and kind of just give kind of examples of this reconciliation of the West and reconciliation of the West with the Western ideals with Japanese tradition. So Runaway Horses by Yukio Mishima is going to be the kind of the embodiment of this idea, this manifestation of this conflict, because that's what the whole book is really about. It kind of is, layered between that and kind of Yukio Mishima's thoughts on returning to the idea of Bushido, which is the way of the samurai, and things like that. But for now, I just want to talk about the reconciliation part. So in Sanshiro, so this is my Sanshiro copy. I guess it's mint edition. It's pretty nice. I really like this book. This might be one of my favorite. Well, I can't even say that. I like every single book, like Kokoro I've loved, Sanshiro I love. They've all been electric in my opinion. But anyways, so the main character, Sanshiro, is a student who just graduated high school and is now going to Tokyo University. But he's from the country. So not only is he going to be kind of indirectly exposed to the conflict between Western and Japanese traditions, he's also going to be in conflict with the country versus, being exposed to the city life for the first time. So anyways, within the first couple of pages, I think the first chapter, you're actually exposed to this kind of hinting at this idea of this people's dissatisfaction with the way Japan is going in regards to its adoption of Western ideals. So Sanshiro, he's on a train, Shinkansen, on his way to, Tokyo from the Inaka, the countryside. And there he meets a man who later turns out to be Professor Hirota, who becomes a pretty integral part of the story. But there he's just a man, he's just talking to him, and they get into discussion about random things. Nothing really has much substance, or what you would think has substance, but it's really layered, where eventually it gets down to they see a Westerner. They get to the bus station, train station, and they see a Westerner, and Professor Hirota, I believe, says, aren't Westerners splendid? Which, given his later position on the West, I don't know if it was sarcastic or what, or if he might have genuinely meant it, but and then Sanshiro replies something along the lines of Japan is headed towards splendidness, magnificence, whatever, and then Professor Hirota counters, Japan is heading towards ruin. And then he later kind of elaborates a little bit and says, blind devotion to Japan won't save her, it will only lead to her downfall. And this is an interesting idea that kind of plays throughout the whole book, where, there's all these changing ideas, there's these changing, philosophies, sciences are changing. It's even mentioned at some point, and this is kind of embodied with Nonomiya, who's the friend of the girl that Sanshiro kind of gets interested in. But Nonomiya, he's a scientist. I think his whole thesis or research area is physics, and it's trying to study the weight or the mass of light, I guess. And Nonomiya spends all his time in his cellar, kind of locked down, and just studies. He's kind of disconnected from the real world, you might say, and is just kind of puts himself into the academic world. But what I mean by this is, so Japan is constantly changing, and one of the things that is said is, since Japan has only been kind of recently recognized as a superpower after the Russo-Japanese War, they need to catch up. That's the whole idea. A lot of the leaders of Japan are like, okay, we have to westernize, we have to modernize, and we have to learn the sciences in 40 years that, the West has been learning for 100 years. So they look at it as a game of catch up. And kind of tying back into, blind devotion to Japan won't save her, it will only lead to her downfall, I think is just an interesting point of view in general. And I think, so I should preface this and maybe warn, whoever the few people that actually watch this are, everything I say is obviously going to be through a Western perspective, and it's going to be biased towards the West. So what I'm about to say might be a little arrogant, but it almost seems like this point of view is a little Western in itself, where, beforehand, there was a little bit more blind devotion to Japan, just the way it's structured, and just the way, the emperor is revered, things like that, versus in United States, it's always been embedded into us from a young age to kind of question authority. The birth of the United States was kind of, we were born out of that mentality. We were born out of that idea of, don't succumb to authority. And, it's written in the, Declaration of Independence that when the government becomes tyrannical, it's a job of the patriots to, overthrow that government. It's a duty of the people to overthrow that government and place a new, more democratic nation. I don't know the exact vernacular, but along the lines, that's what Thomas Jefferson was saying, and then it's a very John Locke idea of, social contract and these ideas of, unalienable rights that, aren't rights given to the people by the government, but instead the government is only there to protect these rights, that they are given to us, they are endowed by our creator, certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and I think pursuit of happiness is what's written in the Declaration. I think John Locke's was life, liberty, and property. I might have gotten those two confused or flipped, but the idea is, the government's not there to rule over the people. The government's there to serve the people. And blind devotion to the government won't save anyone. It will only eventually lead to the downfall, because then you start to ignore corruption. You start to ignore, the shortcomings of your government. And this is where I'm going to kind of get into more opinion, my own opinion, where, I'm in the military. I consider myself a very patriotic person. I love the United States. I love the ideas that embodies the idea of, freedom, of, choosing your own destiny, fighting against this prescribed fate that you have, struggling on. I timed that into a little bit of berserk. But I love that idea. I love this idea that, we're born from, not serving our government, but our government serving us, and having these unalienable rights that, should be protected. Kind of idealistic, but my point with that is, sore demo, even with that, I still understand and recognize the shortcomings of the United States, whether it's in the past through the certain, atrocities that, we've committed, Trail of Tears, things like that. With the current, maybe corruption, shortcomings of the government, I don't think that detracts from the patriotism. I think that, in fact, enhances it, because, the United States and most countries are not their government. That's kind of the head of the snake, you might say. But, the countries, in the perspective of their, respective citizens, are not just the government. It's so much more than that. And, I don't owe an allegiance to the government. I owe an allegiance to the Constitution and the ideas that the United States stands for. And I think that's a nuance. So I really like this, assertion by Professor Hirota, and I think that this is indicative of kind of the clash of Western ideas and Japanese tradition, where he doesn't like that we're adopting so much Western ideas, and he wants to kind of return to tradition. And this is, like I said, I'll get into it more during Runaway Horses, but this is a big idea. Another idea, so quickly, I'm also, during this whole free-flowing literature analysis, whatever, just kind of generally talking, I'm going to talk about the Western idea of love versus Japanese idea of love. And I think this is going to be the biggest one, because this is one of the major themes across all of these books I've read. Kokoro, Sanshiro, Thousand Cranes, The Sound of Waves, less so Runaway Horses, Spring Snow, and it's one of the most interesting ideas to me. And I've even made a previous video about it. It's under my video called Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. It's about the myth of marriage and love. And it kind of goes into the history of that video kind of goes into the history of, the Western idea of love. Where did this idea of, instead of being arranged marriage, instead of marriage being kind of like a contractual obligation, like a legal obligation where, this family gets a dowry, this family gets, this in exchange, it's more of like an economic thing, where how did it become a thing where, we believe in, true love, soulmates, the choice to choose who we love. Where did this idea come from? And this is a big part in all these books of, that idea versus the Japanese idea of Omiai, which is kind of like it's an all-embodying thing where it's arranged marriages and, visiting someone with, visiting a potential partner with the expectation that, hey, we might end up, being married. So that's going to be a pretty big theme that I'm going to cover, at least lightly throughout this kind of spiel. But anyways, so continuing on with Sanshiro, so that's a big part of it. And throughout the book, you can see the way that Japan, and more specifically Tokyo, has changed, where the introduction of the industrialization, introduction of densha, electric trains, just the industry itself has kind of been going more towards a less agricultural and farming-based society into an industrialized society. And at this point in time, early 1900s to mid 1900s, it's already been to that, especially after the Russo-Japanese War. But this is kind of where you can see the difference between the two ideas. And I think it's exemplified by maybe that the countryside is supposed to represent traditional Japan, where they're kind of isolated. It still embodies very much so the traditional Japanese culture, versus the city, which is supposed to embody maybe the idea of Western influences being adopted. And you can kind of see the two contrasts in how Sanshiro actually acts and navigates his way through this life. Very indirect. It's not as direct as Runaway horses, which I'll get to, but so you'll also see this a lot with his friend that he meets in university, Yojiro, I think it's Soseki. But anyway, so he is kind of a literary guy. He likes writing. And one of the examples that I think really highlights this kind of reconciliation, this conflict, whatever, is in the book, he takes a pen name and writes about how he doesn't think that the university should be, giving positions, teaching positions, professor positions to Western people. Instead, he fights for Professor Hirota to get positions within the university. And this is because, a little backstory, Professor Hirota isn't really involved. I think he ends up being a middle school or high school teacher, but it's kind of alluded that he's really smart, he's a genius, he has ideas, but they never go anywhere. He doesn't write about them, he doesn't keep them, he doesn't publish them. And Yojiro Soseki, Sanshiro's friend, really wants Professor Hirota to be known, to get out there, because he really, I guess, subscribes to Professor Hirota's ideas, thinks he's a genius, really respects him. So because of that, Soseki ends up writing under a pen name and kind of putting out these papers in support of Professor Hirota to get a teaching position at Tokyo University instead of the West. And he's pretty explicit with his words. It's kind of a lot of fluff in his papers, but he essentially is saying, like, there's no reason why we should have Western people teaching when we have more qualified Japanese professors who are smarter and know the Japanese culture. So that's all going down in the background. I'll revisit Sanshiro when I talk about the love and kind of the conflict between arranged marriages and things like that. Next is going to be Runaway horses. So this is basically this is going to be a real manifestation of this conflict, and it's because Isao, the main character, is a 19-year-old, I think high school graduate. He might be in university, but he's an excellent, I think it's Kendo. It might be the other martial arts, but I think it's Kendo student. He's the best in Japan, maybe just in his area, but I think it's the best in Japan, where he is fantastic. And I should also mention that Runaway horses, actually I'll go into that later, but anyways, Isao, one of the big things he struggles with is living and dying, more emphasis on the dying, a beautiful death. He wants to die under the sunset looking towards, because the sun is supposed to represent kind of the emperor, he wants to die under the sunset, via seppuku. And he wants to die beautifully. And there's like an aesthetic in that. So that's kind of the struggle he goes with. But the biggest struggle, overarching like political struggle, is that he recognizes that Japan, more specifically the Japanese government, is corrupt. You have a lot of these, the Saudis, you have the prime minister, you have government officials taking bribes, being influenced by Western merchants, things like that. And he doesn't like that. He wants to return to the idea of Bushido, of Japanese tradition. He wants to expel all Westerners. So the whole idea of Runaway Horses, besides the, overarching theme of the rebirth of Kiyoaki from the first book. This book is mostly about Isao's kind of plan to assassinate, with the help of the Japanese military, with the help of his friends, key positions within the Japanese government in order to kind of revitalize Japanese tradition. And this is, juxtapositioned with the League of Divine Wind, which is a real event. In I think 1876, there was an insurrection in Kumamoto where a group of, samurai, the samurai class, they were disillusioned with the government because, after the Meiji Restoration, swords were banned. There was a countrywide sword ban, and that was an attack on Japanese, Bushido, the way of the samurai. That was an attack on the Japanese, culture. Up until that point, that was huge in Japanese culture. It was embedded in the very fabric of Japanese, society, culture, government. So to ban that, they felt that, they were being attacked, their whole identity was being attacked. So with that in the background, Isao tries to emulate this by doing the same thing, but in modern day. And the whole book about Runaway Horses is these whole ideas of, first of all, Isao trying to die beautifully, for the emperor, for the good of Japan. He has no expectation of living, full life, old, decrepit, and, dispelling Western influences. Now, what I really enjoyed about Runaway Horses was, to me, it almost felt like a manifesto or like a kind of a suicide letter by Yukio Mishima. So for those who don't know, Yukio Mishima, he in 1970, I believe, it might have been 1969, but 1970, I believe, Yukio Mishima, the author of this book, pretty much does what Isao does in the book, but in real life. He takes over, first of all, he recruits a bunch of students into an unarmed civilian militia. And then in 1970, he storms the Japanese Self-Defense Force headquarters, or one of the headquarters, and makes a speech, kind of says, basically, screw the Westerners, we need to return back to the Bushido, we need to, return back to what made Japan, Japan. And then he seppukus himself, and he dies. So it was he was almost emulating what he wrote in the book. So I thought that was really interesting. Yukio Mishima was a Japanese nationalist. Sun and Steel is kind of a good introduction on his way of thinking. He put a lot of emphasis on aesthetics, a lot of emphasis on the reconciliation between words and their limitations of words, and the refinement of the body. He believed that you can't be a full person, a complete person, just by working out your academic mind, being stuck in the books. These people who are geniuses aren't really geniuses because they're letting their body wither away. He believed a lot in maybe not judging, but you can get a lot of influence, you can get a lot of information from the people by looking at them. Like their outwards physical traits are very indicative on how they might be in person, which is a very interesting idea. I can't find it specifically, but I remember that even in the book, when Isao is kind of recruiting other college students to, consolidate and to carry out his plan of assassination, he makes a mental note of that, where a lot of the people who look sickly and weak, mentally are also weak. So Yukio Mishima puts a lot of emphasis on the refinement of the body, and that's what Sun and Steel is about. Sun being, working out your body, getting energy from the sun, not locking yourself away. And that's also important because the sun is indicative and kind of representative of the emperor at the time, and kind of the Japanese reverence for the emperor. And the steel is the martial arts part of it. But he talks about how, words are limited by themselves. In order to really fulfill, the intent of words, you have to improve your body, because between words and your body, there's a void that needs to be filled. And that is kind of the only way you fill that void is by, perfecting both. So he was really into aesthetics, really interesting guy. And I kind of think that this whole idea, this whole kind of political vibe that I got, I couldn't help but make connections to the current Patriot Party, kind of like the Trump, support, the Trump movement, where you have a lot of maybe not traditional GOP conservatives, but you have, I'll use the term right wing, or I'll just use the term patriots because I think that's what they referred themselves to. You have a lot of patriots who want to return to, United States isolationism. They are big into the aesthetics. They're big into, bodybuilding, perfecting this body, things like that. And you can see that, especially on like Twitter, on these, 4chan, you can see this idea kind of manifesting itself where you kind of have like a Yukio Mishima type of political outlook adopted in the US. And I thought that was interesting. I can go more into that maybe if people are interested in it. But yeah, I found that very interesting and applicable to today. So next, I'm going to move on to kind of the idea of marriage and love and kind of, the biggest problems these protagonists face in all these books that, as a reader, it's frustrating, but through a storytelling like medium, it's a great, I don't know how you would say it. It's a great motif. It's a great theme. It's a great driver. It's a great lesson to learn. So I'll talk about Spring Snow, and I'm actually all these books kind of relate, so I'm gonna end up backtracking. But in Spring Snow, it's by Yukio Mishima. It's not nearly as political as Runaway Horses, but Spring Snow is basically about Kiyoaki, who's a boy, and it looks like he is 18, 19 age, and it's about kind of his relationship with his childhood friend, Satoko, I think is her name, and how he's unable to kind of fully understand his feelings towards her. And it's kind of how he grows up from a child to a man. But essentially, throughout the book, it's a slow burner. There's not much stuff that goes on. It's very internally dialogue driven. But essentially, I'm gonna shorten Kiyoaki's name to Kiyo because that's actually what Satoko says, refers to him as. But essentially, at the very beginning of the book, Kiyo says he hates her. He doesn't understand why she talks to him, why she flirts to him, and he doesn't understand why she acts how she does. But later on, he kind of finds himself questioning this and not really understanding, but the book ends with him falling in love with her. But the tragedy of this whole story is that she ends up getting married to someone else because he's too late, because he's unwilling to recognize his own feelings for her. And this is a big theme within all of these books. And I think it kind of ties more into the whole theme of coming to age. I think it's a big thing in that, is that if you're not willing to recognize the feelings you have, in people or in your loved ones, it might be too late. So essentially what happens is, throughout time, Kyo and Satoko's love kind of gradually grows, and unfortunately, Kyo's unable to say to himself, yes, I love her. When he finally does, when he finally has the courage to say it, it's too late, because she's been arranged to marry someone else. And eventually he keeps going to her house to see her, and he ends up dying out of exhaustion. So it's a very tragic thing, and it ties more into the overarching idea of, recognizing your own feelings and having the courage and the freedom to act on those. So it's a big mess of things where, in Japan at the time, people didn't necessarily have the freedom to say, hey, I love this girl, I'm gonna marry her. And the girls definitely didn't have that privilege, because it wasn't until much later where women kind of got more political rights and more freedoms in general. But, at that time, they really couldn't say that. And internally, he just didn't have the courage to do so. And this is actually a huge theme throughout all of them, honestly. So moving on to Kokoro, this same idea happens where you have, I'm going to skip to the sensei part where sensei is telling the story for those of you who have read it. Sensei, when he's a student, he ends up boarding with, Oku-san, which is the mother of Ojo-san. And both Oku-san and Ojo-san are Japanese words, they're not actually names. But Oku-san is wife, Oku-san is wife, and then Ojo-san, maybe daughter, I actually don't know. Musume's daughter, but Ojo-san might be something similar. And he ends up falling in love with Oku-san's daughter, Ojo-san. And he's unable, similar to Kyo, he's unable to find the courage to tell her. In the back of his head, all these things are happening where, what if she says no? What if she rejects me? What if, this and that? He makes excuses for himself. And I think this is why it's such a compelling coming-of-age story, because, for those of us, men or women, who, are maybe after, we still struggle with that. There's always that fear of, rejection. What if they say no? What if they, reject me? What if it doesn't work out? I think that's a timeless theme. And, I think the coming of age part is recognizing that, that shouldn't matter, and that you should, have the courage to face those fears. And, the sad part is, in all of these stories, if they would have just tackled those fears and had the courage to declare their love, it probably would have worked. So essentially, Sensei, throughout the book, throughout his portion of the book, he demonstrates that he loves Ojo-san but doesn't have the courage. Eventually, his friend from school, who he labels K, also starts boarding with them because of his own problems at home. He's homeless, whatever. And K also falls in love with Ojo-san. Unlike Sensei, though, K plans on telling her. Sensei, distraught, kind of sabotages that by telling K that he's an idiot for that. He needs to focus on his studying, and how could he do this, blah, blah, blah. And through his harsh words and kind of just surrounding circumstances, K actually kills himself. And this is also a big theme within Kokoro, and kind of the overall kind of sense of melancholy that you feel through all the parts of Kokoro. And, so Sensei eventually does marry Ojo-san after K kills himself. But because of K's death, Sensei feels terrible. He has this dreadful guilt that lasts throughout his life, and it affects the way he looks at humans and human nature. By default, he thinks of humans as selfish, crude, cruel. He cuts himself off from the world. He hates everything. He doesn't talk. He's kind of resigned to living as a hermit, as almost as self-repentance. He's repenting for his crimes. And unfortunately, his relationship with Ojo-san suffers because of that, and it can't, in a sense, it can't be truly consummated. You know, I'm sure they've, you know, it's physically been consummated, but emotionally I don't think it ever reached that point of consummation where, you know, Sensei and Ojo-san could live their relationship and to the potential. And that was because Kei killed himself. And Kei kills himself, you know, partly in part because Sensei didn't have the courage to tell Ojo-san how he felt originally. And this is where the tragedy repeats itself and is so common amongst all these books, where, you know, if Sensei would have just told Ojo-san that, hey, you know, omae no koto ga suki, you know, I love you, you know, Ojo-san no koto ga daisuki, whatever, then this wouldn't have happened. And that's the coming of age part. That's the maturity part. That's learning. And unfortunately in these books, you know, the fact that they're unable to kind of tackle that ends up leading to a world of a permanent place of melancholy. You know, in real life, that might not always be the case, where, you know, even though you miss your chance, you might find someone else, et cetera, like life isn't over. This just really emphasizes the point of taking the chances when you have it, and, you know, having that courage to step into the unknown. And I'm gonna kind of digress a little bit and tie this into The Hero with a Thousand Faces, another video that I did, another book that I did a video on by Joseph Campbell. And essentially it's about, you know, the monomyth and the cycle, the steps that heroes go through in every story, whether it be a myth, religion, a novel like this, it all follows the same structure. And I would say that Sensei's, Kyo's, later Sanshiro's, you know, all these people's hesitance, their reluctance to step into the unknown, to conquer their fears, is indicative of them not completing the hero's journey. Because one of the parts of the hero's journey is call to action, and accepting that call of action, and then stepping into the unknown, stepping into the trials. And now, for example, this is seen in, like, let's say, okay, Star Wars is a good example of the hero's journey. You have Luke Skywalker, who's a kid. You know, he's called to action by Obi-Wan Kenobi, who acts as a hermit. He steps into the trials, which is kind of the movie's, you know, whole progression. He leaves his hometown, he leaves what he knows, he steps into this trial to the underworld, to fight against the Empire. And when he returns with boons, he returns with these gifts. You know, one of those gifts being, you know, emancipation, liberation from the Empire, saving his father, Darth Vader, from, you know, the dark side. You know, it is through these trials and through stepping in the unknowns that he actually gets to reap the benefits. And as Joseph Campbell always says, and even it's a very Nietzsche, whatever, the French philosopher, you know, you slay the dragon that's within you, and by slaying that dragon, you can then follow your bliss. Like, you have to slay the dragon within you before you can continue on. And in the same sense, you know, where Luke Skywalker succeeded, you know, Kyo, Sensei, Sanshiro, they fail to even step into, you know, the underworld, the trials, and therefore they can't slay the dragon, and they can't, you know, return with these gifts from their trials. You know, if they're unwilling to even take the call of action. And that's kind of indicative with, you know, them not recognizing themselves and saying, hey, I love you, to the female or to the girl that they love. And by doing that, they fail the hero's journey. And through that failure of the hero's journey, they can't move on, and they're essentially slayed. And kind of more into that, you know, throughout the hero's journey, a lot of these people, you know, are spiritually reborn. And that's kind of the coming of age part, is where, you know, Luke, throughout his time, against the Empire, he's spiritually reborn. And this can be seen, after Darth Vader reveals that I am your father, after his training in Dagobah, after these, big events happen, physically he's not reborn, but spiritually, in some sense, he's reborn as a new person, and he continues on. All these people in this Japanese literature that I've read that I'm talking about, they don't go through that process. And so they can't actually succeed in the hero's journey and get to the goal they want. So I'll go back to Sanshiro, where Sanshiro kind of beat a dead horse at the same thing, but it's the same thing where you have Sanshiro and Mineko, who it's clear that they like each other, but neither of them have the words or courage to say so. And like other books, it ends up where Mineko ends up getting married off to someone else, and that's it. That's a harsh reality, and it's unfortunate because the whole time you're like, dude, just say something, girl, just say something, please. All you have to say is 3 words: I love you, or I like you, or whatever. Just say it. Have the courage to say it. And unfortunately, that's not the case. And this happens throughout most of the books. This is the exception where it's more just a coming of the age, a very light book. It's called The Sound of Waves by Yukio Mishima. And it's kind of the opposite, where the main character does go through the hero's journey properly. He does step into the trials. And it's basically about, let me see the main character. Sorry, I forgot his name, but it takes place on Utajima, which is Song Island, because Uta means song, and then Jima, island. But essentially it's about a man, I guess. Not man, sorry. He's a young guy, probably like 23, 19, something like that. Trying to see if I can find the name. But essentially, in this book, the man falls in love with kind of a girl who's out of his reach, where she's, I think, a noble, something like that. She comes to the island, she's a noble. And her father won't let him date her. So essentially, he declares his love, whatever. They write back and forth. But his call to action isn't necessarily the act of declaring his love. His call to action is proving to the girl's father that he will take care of her. And the trials that he undergoes is when the father forces him to go on a fishing trip. And it is through this trial, through this entrance to the unknown, to the underworld, that he goes through this trial and he returns successfully. And then the father, after him demonstrating his hard work, his, virtuous nature, etc., allows him to marry the girl. It's just indicative, once again, that, you have to tackle your fears. You have to be willing to go into the unknown, to slay that dragon before you can actually, metaphorically slay the dragon, before you can actually reap the benefits and come back to the overworld successfully. So that's basically all of that. Let me take a real quick look at see if I have anything else. So I think that, so I guess some things that I really want to talk about. I really liked, at this point I'm kind of digressing. You can end the video here and you probably get most of it, but in Sanshiro, I really like the quote. It's on like page 196 of at least this edition, where it's at the very, I think it might be one of the last pages, but Mineko looks at Sanshiro after she's already been married off, and she says, "For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me." So I found this really interesting because I wasn't sure, is her transgression not being able to reconcile her feelings towards Sanshiro and letting Sanshiro, pass? Because when she says it's a Bible, I think it's a Bible verse or whatever, I'm not completely sure, but for I acknowledge my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. So is Sanshiro forever going to be a reminder that she sinned, and is that sin her inability to live truly to herself? Or is the sin that she loved Sanshiro in the first place? And that's something that I found pretty interesting, and, you know, might be something you want to ponder on, because, you know, things like that, I just think it just helps you get a kind of feel of the whole book, and I really like that idea. Another idea that's pretty big in all these books is the idea of aesthetics and kind of feminine beauty and masculine beauty too, but I won't dive too deep in this, but especially Yukio Mishima, as I mentioned before, he was really into aesthetics. But what, you know, it's not a subjective beauty where you're like, hey, that girl's attractive. It's more of a aesthetically feminine, appreciating the aesthetics of a female, the female beauty, just, you know, recognizing the part a female plays in comparison to the male. It's a very yin yang type of feeling where you have these two pieces and how they fit together. And it's a very interesting idea, and I think that's, you know, touched upon a lot. And I think this whole idea of aesthetics and, you know, eternity versus, you know, finite time, you know, father being eternity, mother being like the finite time, and how that relates is demonstrated a lot indirectly in all of these literature, in all this literature. So I also wrote, sorry, I have a little notes that I kind of wrote about. So I also wrote something about kind of Hemingway, and a lot of these kind of share the same feeling, same atmosphere as The Sun Always Rises, I think it's called, by Hemingway, where you have Lady Ashley and the main character not being able to consummate their love due to the main character, his genitals, I think, were blown off during World War I, and it's about that struggle where, you know, they might love each other, but due to their inability to consummate their love physically, it doesn't happen. Not to mention that, me personally, I hated Lady Ashley in that. I thought she was degenerate, and it was awful. I did not like that. But yeah, I think that's essentially what I have. I know this wasn't a really well analytical, well presented, you know, video, and it's just really me talking, but maybe some people will find some good pieces, kernels of information. And if anything, at least I can just talk to the wind and kind of consolidate my thoughts and get them out there. But yeah, I would definitely recommend all of these books. And, you know, in order of recommendation, I really liked Kokoro. Actually, I can't even really. Biggest ones are Spring Snow, Kokoro, and Sanshiro are the ones that I really enjoyed, that fit the vibe of coming to age and kind of, you know, reconciling Western versus Japanese tradition, the whole idea of not having the courage to say yes to love, the whole idea of reconciling arranged marriages to the Western ideal of love, and the Runaway Horses I really like just because of the political, you know, commentary, I guess. But anyways, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll probably do a little bit more official formatting, better presentation, more analytical videos in the future, but, you know, I've been on a reading spree and I just kind of want to get this out there, so I appreciate the time.